The moment someone tells you that you no longer belong inside your own home, you learn exactly how dangerous confidence can become when it is built on the wrong piece of paper. I still remember the smell of pine drifting through the open window as my pickup climbed the narrow mountain road that had carried 4 generations of my family to the same cabin. It had been almost 8 months since I had last visited because a construction project had kept me working across the state, but every curve in that road felt as familiar as my own heartbeat. My grandfather had carved that route into the mountainside long before there were vacation homes, neighborhood entrances, or homeowners association signs scattered across the valley below. I expected silence when I reached the cabin. Instead, I saw thin gray smoke rising from the stone chimney. At first I smiled because I thought maybe one of my cousins had stopped by without telling me. Then I noticed a spotless black sport utility vehicle parked beside the porch with the Homeowners Association logo displayed on the driver's door. My smile disappeared before I even turned off the engine. The front porch looked different. Fresh flower pots lined the steps. Someone had replaced the welcome mat my grandmother bought decades ago. Curtains I had never seen covered the front windows. Even the rocking chair that always faced the mountains had been moved toward the driveway, as though someone wanted to watch every vehicle climbing the road. I stepped out of my truck holding the old brass key that had opened that front door since I was a boy. Before I reached the porch, the front door swung open. A woman I recognized immediately walked outside, carrying a coffee mug as if she had lived there for years. Rebecca Collins, the president of the Homeowners Association, looked at me with complete confidence instead of surprise. She did not ask who I was. She did not seem confused. She simply smiled politely and said, "Can I help you?" For a second, I honestly thought she was joking. I laughed once and lifted my key toward the cabin. "Actually, this is my place." Her expression never changed. She calmly stepped onto the porch, folded her arms, and replied, "No, it is not anymore." I stared at her, waiting for the punchline that never came. She explained that the cabin had been abandoned for months, that the Homeowners Association had taken responsibility for maintaining the property, and that she had been authorized to occupy it while long-term community plans were being discussed. Every sentence sounded rehearsed, delivered with the certainty of someone who had repeated the same story many times. I interrupted her and told her my property taxes had been paid, my insurance remained active, and my family had owned the cabin for more than 50 years. She barely reacted. Instead, she pointed toward a laminated notice attached beside my own front door and calmly informed me that I was trespassing on community-managed property until ownership questions were resolved. Then she looked directly into my eyes and spoke the words I will never forget. "You do not belong here anymore." Standing there with my grandfather's key still in my hand, staring at the front porch where I had celebrated birthdays, holidays, and family reunions, I realized someone had not simply entered my mountain house. They had convinced themselves it had never truly belonged to me at all. Rebecca remained standing on the porch as though she had every reason to believe the mountain belonged to her, while I slowly lowered the old brass key into my pocket because I realized arguing there would accomplish nothing. I looked past her shoulder into the living room and saw family photographs missing from the stone fireplace mantel. The handmade quilt my grandmother stitched every winter had disappeared from the couch. Someone had rearranged the furniture until the cabin no longer looked like the place where I had learned to fish, split firewood, and watch the first snowfall with my grandfather. It felt as though my family's history had been carefully packed away and replaced with somebody else's version of ownership. I climbed back into my truck without another word and drove a quarter-mile down the mountain until I reached an overlook where the valley opened beneath me. The same view had not changed in decades. Pine forests stretched across the ridges. The small lake reflected the afternoon sun, and the winding gravel road disappeared through the trees exactly as it always had. My grandfather used to park there whenever we returned from town. He would shut off the engine, point toward the road below, and remind me that the mountain remembered every person who respected it. Then he would smile and repeat the sentence I never truly understood as a child. People forget ownership long before they forget convenience. At the time, I thought he was talking about neighbors borrowing equipment or hikers crossing private land. Sitting there with the cabin occupied by someone who believed confidence mattered more than records, I finally understood what he had been preparing me for all those years. My grandfather built that cabin more than 50 years before the subdivision existed. Long before expensive vacation homes appeared across the mountainside, he and several friends cleared trees by hand and cut the original road into solid rock so trucks could reach the property. Every load of lumber, every window, every stone in the fireplace had traveled along that same narrow mountain road. Later, when developers purchased the surrounding land to build luxury homes, they asked my grandfather for permission to continue using the existing road because creating another entrance across the steep terrain would have cost a fortune. He agreed because he believed neighbors should help one another, not because he intended to surrender ownership. My father repeated that story every Thanksgiving when the family gathered around the stone fireplace. He always ended with the same reminder: never mistake permission for surrender. I reached for my phone and opened the county property tax records. Every payment had been made. The cabin remained listed under my family's ownership. The mailing address had never changed. Nothing suggested abandonment. Nothing suggested foreclosure. Nothing suggested transfer. Yet Rebecca had spoken with absolute certainty, as though paperwork I had never seen had somehow erased half a century of documented history. Before leaving the overlook, I looked back toward the cabin barely visible between the tall pines. A faint trail of smoke still drifted above the chimney, while evening sunlight touched the roof my grandfather built with his own hands. At that moment, I stopped asking how Rebecca believed she belonged there. Instead, I began asking a far more important question. What had convinced an entire homeowners association that they owned something my family had never stopped owning? The next morning, I drove straight to the county recorder's office instead of returning to the mountain. If Rebecca truly believed the homeowners association had some legal claim to my cabin, the answer would not be found in an argument on the front porch. It would be sitting inside a filing cabinet, recorded on paper, signed by someone with authority, or it would not exist at all. The courthouse looked exactly the way it had when my father first brought me there years ago to transfer my grandfather's estate after he passed away. The same limestone walls, the same polished wooden counters, and even the same faint smell of old paper and coffee greeted me as I walked inside. I requested every document connected to my parcel, the surrounding subdivision, and the original development filed decades earlier. The clerk recognized my family name immediately and quietly stacked several thick folders across the counter. I spent hours turning page after page, tracing legal descriptions, survey references, easements, tax maps, and subdivision plats. Every deed clearly showed my family's ownership of the cabin parcel. Every annual tax payment matched what I had already seen online. Every transfer involving neighboring lots stopped neatly at their own property boundaries. Yet something else began catching my attention. The Homeowners Association documents repeatedly described maintenance responsibilities, architectural guidelines, and community regulations, but whenever the mountain cabin appeared on a map, the legal descriptions carefully avoided stating that the association actually owned it. The wording seemed strangely cautious, almost as though someone wanted readers to assume ownership without ever writing those exact words. That detail stayed with me long after I left the courthouse. Before driving back toward the mountain, I stopped at the only general store within 20 miles, a place where nearly everyone eventually crossed paths. While I waited for a cup of coffee, an older man studying fishing supplies looked over and asked whether I was related to Harold Walker. I smiled and told him Harold had been my grandfather. His face immediately brightened with recognition. He introduced himself as Carl Benson, explaining that he had lived in the valley long before the subdivision existed. When I briefly mentioned finding someone living inside my cabin, he slowly shook his head instead of looking surprised. "Most people up here have stopped asking questions," he said quietly. "They just assume the Homeowners Association has always been in charge." I asked him if anyone remembered who built the mountain road. He laughed softly and pointed through the store window toward the forested hillside. "Your grandfather did. Everybody my age knows that. The newer folks never learned because nobody bothered telling them." His words settled heavily in my mind. This was no longer just one woman making outrageous claims. Entire generations of newer residents had accepted a version of history that slowly replaced documented fact. As I stepped outside carrying my coffee, my phone vibrated with an email notification. It came from the Homeowners Association. Attached was a formal notice stating that unauthorized entry into the cabin could result in additional enforcement measures while the association continued exercising what it described as community management authority. I read the message twice before looking back toward the mountains rising beyond the parking lot. Rebecca was no longer simply staying inside my cabin. She had convinced an entire neighborhood that the fiction had become reality, and somehow nobody had ever bothered to compare the story with the records waiting quietly inside the county courthouse. That evening I drove back toward the mountain, but I did not stop at the cabin. Instead, I continued another half-mile along an overgrown logging trail that very few people even remembered existed. The trail ended beside a weathered equipment shed my grandfather had built decades earlier to store chainsaws, fuel cans, and survey stakes whenever he worked on the property. The roof sagged slightly under the weight of countless winters, and the faded red paint had almost disappeared beneath climbing vines. But the heavy padlock was still exactly where my father had left it years ago. The old key hanging from my truck key ring fit perfectly. As the door creaked open, the familiar scent of cedar, machine oil, and dry pine boards rushed out like a memory that had been waiting patiently for someone to return. Dust floated through narrow beams of afternoon sunlight, while shelves filled with neatly labeled wooden boxes lined the back wall. My grandfather had believed every important document deserved a safe place, even before computers stored everything digitally. I searched each shelf until I found a long metal cabinet tucked beneath a workbench. Inside were rolled survey maps tied with faded blue ribbon, leather notebooks, handwritten maintenance logs, and thick envelopes marked with dates stretching back more than half a century. I carefully carried everything onto the workbench and began unfolding one document after another. The first survey showed the original cabin parcel exactly as I expected, but the second map stopped me completely. It displayed the mountain years before the subdivision had ever been planned. A single road curved from the county highway to the cabin, and every future neighborhood street connected to that same route. My grandfather had drawn detailed notes in the margins describing construction costs, drainage improvements, and timber removal. Folded inside the map was another document stamped by the county recorder. It was a permanent access easement allowing future neighboring landowners to travel across the private road while leaving ownership entirely with my grandfather and his heirs. I read every line twice before setting it aside. The Homeowners Association had permission to use the road. They had never been granted ownership of it. Then I opened the final leather journal resting at the bottom of the cabinet. My grandfather's handwriting filled every page with careful observations about weather, repairs, family visits, and conversations with developers during the early planning stages of the subdivision. One entry had been underlined twice. It read, "The road belongs to the house, not the neighborhood. Someday people may confuse convenience with ownership, so keep every paper together because the truth is patient even when people are not." I closed the journal and looked again at the survey spread across the workbench. For the first time since finding Rebecca inside my cabin, the entire picture began fitting together. The subdivision depended on a road my family still owned. The Homeowners Association had spent years acting as though permission to use that road somehow transformed into permanent control over everything connected to it. They had built confidence on a misunderstanding that had quietly grown stronger with every new homeowner who arrived. As the evening sun disappeared behind the mountains, I rolled the survey back into its protective tube, placed the journal inside my truck, and realized I was no longer searching for answers. I had just found the first piece of evidence that could change everything. The following morning, I spread every document across the long conference table inside the office of Daniel Brooks, a property attorney whose family had practiced real estate law in the county for 3 generations. He did not rush through the papers or offer quick opinions. Instead, he adjusted his reading glasses, opened the oldest survey first, and compared every legal description with the recorded deeds I had collected from the courthouse. The office remained almost completely silent except for the sound of paper turning and the occasional click of his keyboard as he searched county archives. Nearly an hour passed before he finally leaned back in his chair and looked directly at me with an expression that mixed surprise and quiet satisfaction. He said the ownership of the cabin itself was remarkably clear. The property had never been sold, transferred, abandoned, or incorporated into the Homeowners Association. Every deed formed an unbroken chain from my grandfather to my father and finally to me. The taxes had been paid every single year without interruption. The insurance policies matched the same legal description. Nothing in the public record suggested anyone else had any ownership interest whatsoever. Then he reached for the rolled survey showing the original mountain road and carefully laid it beside the subdivision plat. He traced the route with his finger until it reached the entrance of the neighborhood before looking back at me. "This," he said quietly, "is where the entire situation changes." He explained that the permanent easement gave neighboring property owners the legal right to travel across the private road, but it did not transfer ownership of that road to the Homeowners Association. An easement allowed access. It did not erase the rights of the landowner beneath it. I thought about my grandfather's journal and realized every sentence suddenly made perfect legal sense. Daniel continued comparing measurements, boundary calls, and survey monuments before opening another digital county map on his computer screen. Modern satellite imagery aligned almost perfectly with the original survey from decades earlier. Even after years of improvements and resurfacing, the road still occupied the same recorded corridor my grandfather had built. Then Daniel noticed something neither of us had expected. The main entrance monument installed by the Homeowners Association, complete with decorative stone walls, landscaping, and security cameras, sat partially inside the private road easement rather than on association-owned land. It had apparently been constructed under the assumption that the association controlled everything surrounding the entrance. Daniel smiled slightly, not because anyone had made a mistake, but because assumptions carried very little weight against recorded documents. He recommended hiring an independent licensed surveyor to verify every property corner before taking any formal action. I agreed immediately. 2 days later, the survey crew arrived with professional equipment, satellite receivers, and historical records provided directly by the county. They spent the entire day locating original iron monuments hidden beneath decades of leaves and soil. Late that afternoon, the lead surveyor called me over to review the preliminary findings. Every marker matched my grandfather's original survey with remarkable accuracy. The cabin belonged to me. The road belonged to me. The Homeowners Association possessed exactly what the recorded easement granted and nothing more. As I folded the updated survey into its protective case, I realized I no longer needed to wonder whether Rebecca believed her own story. The documents had quietly answered the only question that truly mattered, and they were about to speak much louder than any argument ever could. Daniel advised me not to confront Rebecca again until every document had been organized into a complete legal record, and that turned out to be the best advice anyone could have given me. Winning an argument on the front porch would accomplish nothing if I wanted a lasting solution. Winning with facts would accomplish everything. Over the next week, we quietly assembled every piece of evidence into a timeline that stretched back more than 50 years. Certified copies of every recorded deed arrived from the county recorder. The independent surveyor finalized his report with detailed measurements showing each property corner, every boundary marker, and the exact location of the private mountain road. Historic aerial photographs confirmed that the road existed years before the subdivision was ever approved. Even the original development application contained references acknowledging that access to the new neighborhood depended on an existing private roadway. Daniel organized each document inside labeled binders until the story almost told itself without anyone saying a single word. While we prepared, life on the mountain continued exactly as Rebecca expected. Friends who lived nearby occasionally mentioned seeing her drinking coffee on the front porch, greeting delivery drivers, and chatting with residents as though she had become the rightful caretaker of the cabin. She appeared completely comfortable, convinced that confidence alone had settled the matter. I never drove past the property during that time because Daniel reminded me that patience often produces stronger evidence than confrontation. Instead, I watched the mountain from a distance and focused on preparing for the moment when assumptions would finally meet recorded history. One afternoon, the survey crew invited me back to verify the newly installed boundary stakes before the final report was filed. Bright orange markers now stood exactly where the original iron monuments had been located beneath decades of leaves. Looking at those markers felt strangely emotional because they represented something much larger than property lines. They represented continuity. Every measurement matched the survey my grandfather had preserved inside the old equipment shed. Every coordinate confirmed that the land had remembered the truth even while people had forgotten it. Before leaving, The lead surveyor pointed toward the entrance of the subdivision and quietly observed that most residents probably had no idea they were driving across privately owned land every day. That sentence stayed with me throughout the drive home. Rebecca had built her authority upon a misunderstanding repeated often enough that it eventually sounded like fact. Yet facts have a remarkable quality. They remain exactly the same whether people believe them or not. A few days later, Daniel called with the final piece we had been waiting for. The title examination was complete. There were no hidden claims, no forgotten transfers, no missing signatures, and no legal defects affecting my ownership. Everything aligned perfectly with the surveys, the deeds, the tax records, and my grandfather's journal. Daniel smiled as he closed the last binder and told me we were finished gathering evidence. The next step was no longer about discovering the truth. It was about presenting it in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. As I carried the neatly organized binders back to my truck, I thought about the sentence my grandfather had written decades earlier. The truth is patient even when people are not. Standing there with every recorded fact finally assembled in my hands, I realized that patience had done exactly what he promised. It had quietly transformed a family story into undeniable proof, and the moment Rebecca saw those documents, the version of history she had been living inside would begin to unravel. The hearing was scheduled on a clear autumn morning, and the courthouse felt quieter than I remembered from my previous visits. Daniel carried two neatly organized binders while I held the original survey tube and my grandfather's leather journal. We did not arrive with dramatic speeches or complicated theories because the evidence already spoke with remarkable clarity. Rebecca entered the courtroom a few minutes later with two members of the Homeowners Association board. She smiled politely as though she expected another routine disagreement that would end with the association maintaining its position. When our case was called, the judge asked both sides to present the basis for their claims. Rebecca explained that the association had maintained the cabin during my absence and believed it had authority over the property because it sat within the community boundaries shown on modern neighborhood maps. She referred to maintenance notices, community policies, and the belief that abandoned structures could eventually become the responsibility of the association. The judge listened carefully without interruption before turning toward Daniel. My attorney began with the recorded deed, then the uninterrupted chain of ownership, followed by decades of tax records showing continuous payment by my family. Each certified document was handed to the court one after another in calm, deliberate order. Then came the independent survey, the historic subdivision plat, and finally the original access easement preserved by my grandfather. The courtroom remained silent as the surveyor explained that the private mountain road had existed long before the subdivision and that ownership had never transferred away from my family. The easement granted access to neighboring landowners but did not convey title to either the road or the cabin parcel. The judge carefully compared the historical survey with the modern survey and asked several technical questions about boundary monuments, recorded coordinates, and the legal distinction between an easement and ownership. Every answer matched the recorded documents already before the court. Rebecca's attorney reviewed the papers quietly before acknowledging that no recorded deed existed transferring the property or roadway to the Homeowners Association. For the first time since I had found Rebecca inside the cabin, I saw uncertainty replace confidence on her face. She looked down at the maps spread across the evidence table as though she were seeing the mountain for the first time. After a brief recess, the judge returned and delivered a clear ruling. The court recognized my uninterrupted ownership of the cabin, confirmed that the private mountain road remained my property, and declared that the Homeowners Association possessed only the recorded easement rights described in the original documents. Community rules could not replace recorded title, and long-held assumptions could not erase legal ownership. The decision was calm, precise, and completely supported by the evidence. As the hearing concluded, several board members quietly approached the survey maps with genuine curiosity rather than disagreement. They admitted they had always believed the association owned the entrance road because that was simply what they had been told when they purchased their homes. Walking out of the courthouse into the crisp mountain air, I realized the greatest surprise was not that the truth had prevailed. It was that the truth had been sitting inside public records the entire time, patiently waiting for someone to read them instead of repeating a story that had grown stronger with every passing year. 3 days after the court issued its ruling, I drove back up the mountain with a licensed contractor, a surveyor, and copies of the final judgment neatly stored inside my truck. The air smelled of fresh pine after an overnight rain, and the gravel road looked exactly as it had when my grandfather first taught me to drive an old pickup along its winding curves. This time, however, I was not returning to argue with anyone. I was returning to restore clear boundaries that should never have been questioned. Rebecca was standing on the porch when we arrived. She watched quietly as the surveyor confirmed the boundary markers one final time and the contractor unloaded the materials for a custom steel gate. It was not a massive barrier, nor was it designed to keep the neighborhood trapped inside the mountain. It was a simple entrance placed exactly on my property line where the private road began. Daniel had carefully reviewed every measurement before construction started, making certain the gate would fully respect the permanent access easement recorded decades earlier. Residents would continue using the road exactly as before because the easement guaranteed that right. The only difference was that the entrance would finally acknowledge the legal ownership that had existed all along. Rebecca slowly walked toward me holding a folder against her side. Her confident tone from our first meeting had disappeared, replaced by something much quieter. She admitted that after reading the court documents herself, she realized the association had relied on assumptions passed from one board to another instead of verifying the public records. She apologized for entering the cabin and for believing community authority extended beyond what the law actually allowed. I accepted her apology because anger no longer served any purpose. My goal had never been to embarrass anyone or create unnecessary conflict. I simply wanted my family's history to be recognized and respected. While the contractor installed the gate, several neighbors gathered nearby to watch. Many introduced themselves for the first time and admitted they had never known the mountain road was privately owned. An older couple thanked me for keeping the easement in place because they had worried the neighborhood might lose its only practical access to the county highway. I smiled and explained that my grandfather granted that access to help future neighbors, and I intended to honor his decision exactly as he had written it. By late afternoon, the installation was complete. The dark steel gate swung smoothly across the entrance before stopping beside a small bronze plaque mounted on the stone pillar. The plaque did not contain warnings or threats. It simply read, "Private Road. Permanent access easement honored by the Walker family since 1971. Every resident remained free to travel through exactly as before, but now every person entering the mountain understood the difference between permission and ownership." As the sun settled behind the western ridge, Rebecca approached the gate, paused for a moment, and quietly thanked me for choosing cooperation instead of retaliation. Watching the first family drive peacefully through the open entrance, I thought about the sentence my grandfather had written years earlier inside his journal. "The road belongs to the house, not the neighborhood." For the first time since I returned to the mountain, those words no longer felt like a warning from the past. They had become a promise that the truth, once restored, could protect everyone equally. Several weeks passed before the mountain truly felt like home again. The cabin slowly regained its familiar rhythm as I unpacked the family photographs, returned my grandmother's quilt to the old couch, and placed my grandfather's journal back on the stone fireplace mantel where it belonged. Every morning began with the sound of wind moving through the pines and ended with the quiet comfort of knowing that nothing inside those walls had been lost after all. The Homeowners Association board held a special meeting not long after the court decision, and this time I accepted their invitation. The atmosphere could not have been more different from the first day I met Rebecca on my front porch. Instead of arguments and assumptions, the meeting centered on documents, cooperation, and solutions. Daniel attended with me, and together we finalized an updated permanent easement agreement that incorporated the original recorded rights while adding modern maintenance responsibilities shared by everyone who depended on the mountain road. The agreement protected my ownership, guaranteed uninterrupted access for every resident, and established a simple process to prevent future misunderstandings. Rebecca stood before the community and publicly acknowledged that the association had relied on tradition instead of verified records for far too many years. She accepted responsibility for the mistake and announced that she would step down as president once the transition to a new board was complete. Nobody applauded or celebrated her decision because the moment did not feel like a victory over another person. It felt like the closing of a chapter that should never have been written in the first place. The new board voted to create a property records committee so every future decision involving land ownership would begin with public documents rather than assumptions. That single change may have been the most important outcome of the entire experience. A few days later, I invited several neighbors to the cabin for coffee. Many admitted they had driven that mountain road for years without knowing its history. I showed them my grandfather's original survey, the faded photographs of the road under construction, and the journal that had quietly preserved the truth through every passing decade. They listened with genuine curiosity, and by the end of the afternoon, the story no longer belonged only to my family. It had become part of the community's shared history. Before everyone left, we walked together to the entrance where the bronze plaque reflected the warm evening sunlight. Cars continued passing through the open gate exactly as they always had, except now each driver understood why it stood there. The road had never been about control. It had always been about trust, responsibility, and respecting the people who came before us. As the last light disappeared behind the mountains, I opened my grandfather's journal one final time and found the page that had guided everything from the beginning. Beneath the sentence about the road protecting the house, I noticed one final handwritten line I had somehow overlooked during those frantic first days. It read, "The house was never the treasure. The character of the people who protect it will always matter more." I closed the journal, looked out across the quiet mountain, and realized that justice had arrived exactly the way my grandfather believed it would. Not through anger, not through revenge, and not through louder voices, but through patience, truth, and records that never stopped telling the same honest story.